All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about deer biology. We'll talk about um, a lot of different features and things specific to white-tailed deer and other deer species. And so we're going to kind of go through the biological characteristics of these animals. So first, we'll talk about their senses. So humans, we have 5 senses. Deer actually have 6, so they have an additional sense. And so our senses, obviously, we have sight, we have hearing, we have touch, we have smell, and we have taste. All right, those are our 5 senses: your eyes, your ears, your sense of touch, your nose to smell with, and your mouth. All right. Deer actually have an additional organ in the roof of their mouth called a vomeral nasal organ, or a VNO. And so this is in the roof of their mouth, and basically it's a has additional olfactory sensors, and so it's a place where they can additionally smell things. All right, so they've got their nose they can smell with. They also have this they can smell with. So talking about specific their vision, their field of view is quite a bit greater than ours because of the position of their eyes on their head. So we can only see about 180 degrees. Deer can see 300 degrees. So basically everything except directly behind their head. Um, so deer also have are typically colorblind, or they don't have a full color vision like we do. So uh, most colors are going to appear brown to gray to deer. Um, they are somewhat sensitive to blue, so they can see blue somewhat, but they might not be able to see other colors. Um, all right, and so this talks a little bit more about those different wavelengths, what they can see, the UV light, and so on and so forth. So they basically are somewhat colorblind. They can see blues, yellows, and grays. All right, but they are practically red, green colorblind. They cannot see red or green. All right, this is obviously we can't see exactly how deer see, but this is roughly what the think that deer vision looks somewhat like. And I've seen some different one of these, so keep in mind that's not 100% accurate. Okay, this talks about some of their body language, so they can communicate to one another via body language. So, talking about the white flag, that's when a deer displays its tail up. This is usually a cue that there are danger. You have ears pinned back, which is a sign of aggression, like you see the doe here is coming towards this other doe. Excuse me. um, you have hair raising up on the back of the sides. This usually occurs when a buck is about to fight, so his hair will literally stand up. And then you have flailing, which is a gesture when 2 deer fight with their front legs. Talking about deer hearing, so deer can hear fairly well, but they do have directional hearing. So they have the ability to move their ears to a specific direction to hear without turning their head. So a lot of times you'll see as they're walking and feeding and doing different things, they're moving those ears around, and that's because they're changing the direction of their hearing to see what's around them via sound. They have a sense of touch, so they have hooves. Obviously, they feel with their feet. Um, most sense of touch is in their hair follicles across the entire body, but they have these specialized hairs called vibrissae, and so these are kind of these whiskers. You'll see some right here under their chin, back under their neck. Some you'll see some up on the very top of their forehead, um, and so this allows them to have a kind of a sense of touch. So they're extra sensitive. They're not like the other hairs on their body. Talking about scent, obviously deer smell really well, so they use scent as a major way to communicate to one another. So we're going to talk about some of those different ways to do that. So they have 7 different scent glands that they utilize to communicate to one another. Typically, it's all revolving around the breeding season. So you have the tarsal gland. All right, that is the big dark gland you see way up on the top of their leg, or halfway up their leg, I should say rather. That's the one most people uh, pretty well know about. Below that, you have a metatarsal gland lower on their leg. You have a preorbital gland, which is a gland right here, close to their eye. So a lot of times you'll see deer when they're working a scrape rubbing a limb with their face, and they're actually secreting things from that gland. You have a preputial gland. All right, so this is down there in their groin region. You have interdigital gland. So this is uh, going to be in between their hooves or their toes, so to speak, so they actually can secrete stuff there. They have a forehead gland, so right up here above their eyes, in between their antlers. And then they also have a nasal gland, so right here on their nose, they also have a gland that can secrete stuff. So it says, fun fact, whitetails have 297 million olfactory receptors. So olfactory receptors are the sensors that are used to smell things, right? A dog only has 220 million. All right, so deer can actually smell better than dogs can, and humans only have about 5 million. So we can't smell anything like white-tailed deer can. A common way I've heard described is, is we go down the road and get close to McDonald's, we can smell McDonald's, right? The deer doesn't smell McDonald's. The deer smells specifically hamburger, buns, pickles, onions, ketchup, mustard, and can break down that scent to know the exact things that are there. All right, and so there's two different ways that deer use scent to communicate, and those are rubs and scrapes. So rubs are when they rub antlers on trees, like this buck here on the right-hand side. And so a lot of people think they're doing that to get the velvet off their racks, or they're too sharp in their antlers. But that's not really necessarily why they're doing that. They're actually rubbing that forehead gland on that rub, and that secretes things, and that's a way that they communicate to one another to kind of mark territory, so on and so forth. You have scrapes. So scrapes are a area where they've pawed all the ground up. So you'll have kind of a circle anywhere from maybe 2 foot in diameter, as big as a car hood, and so everything has just been it's just bare dirt where they've pawed the ground, no leaves or anything. And typically there's going to be an overhanging branch, so a branch about head height, for them to be able to rub their face on. And so bucks and does both use scrapes. They'll urinate in them. They will actually urinate in a way so that the urine will roll down their tarsal gland. And so those are kind of like Facebook for deer. Okay, it's kind of how they communicate. They can see who's in the neighborhood, who's been there, what are they doing, who's getting ready for the breeding season, so on and so forth. All right, and then also the interdigital gland, the gland between their toes, when they're making that scrape, they're able to lay some scent down. So talked about rub urination. So this is when they pee in a way so it runs down their tarsal gland. Okay, we talked about that VNO, that second nose. Sometimes you'll see deer do this thing right here on the right-hand side. It's called a lip curl. And so what they're doing is they're sucking in air to try to get more scent to that vomeral nasal organ, or that VNO, to be able to better smell what's going on. So they might have got just a whiff of something they're not cool with. They don't know what's going on. And so that is just a survival mechanism to so they can find predators. So this talks a little bit about scrapes. Bucks of all ages use scrapes, so it's not just something for big bucks. Little bucks will use them. Mature bucks make about 85% more scrapes than yearling bucks. Scraping activity peaks just prior to the peak of the rut, but active scrapes may be found over several months. And actually, a lot of times you'll find some scrapes in areas that are active year-round. researchers have found that 85% of scraping happens at night. So the majority of scrapes are active during the nighttime. So the deer come out of their beds and when they feel safe, and they go and utilize these scrapes. A sense of taste. So whitetails have a very high sense of taste. It's very influenced by the smell, and so they can basically pick what plants they should eat based on what nutrients it has. All right, they don't actually know that, but their brain tells them that based on what they smell and taste from the plants. Talking about tracks, a lot of people say that you can look at a track and say, well, that's a buck track or that's a doe track, and that's not necessarily the case. It is often that a larger track is going to mean a larger deer, but not necessarily a buck, not necessarily a doe. Herd composition. So these are terms everyone probably should know at this point. Bucks are males, does are females, fawns are deer less than 12 months of age. A button buck is a buck between 4 and 12 months of age. So he'll have little buttons on top of his head. So if you look, actually that one is not. That's a female fawn, but they'll have these buttons right here up on the top of their forehead where their antlers will be the following year. Those are called button bucks. So talking about home range size, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Fawn recruitment, that is basically the number of fawns that are born in a doe population that survive. Okay, so how many? So for instance, if you had 100 does and they produce 40 fawns, that is a 0.4 or 40% fawn recruitment rate. You have a buck to doe ratio. So how many bucks are there compared to does in a given population? You have age structure, which we've talked about a little bit. So this is talking about the different ages of deer within a population. You have deer density. So this is how many deer live in an area. So this number is typically going to be expressed DPSM, deer per square mile. So 1 square mile is 640 acres. Talking about whitetail deer food. So whitetails consume 4 to 6 pounds of forage each day. That's roughly 1,400 to well over 2,000 pounds of forage per deer per year. It's quite a bit if it adds up. Deer are ruminants, which are kind of like cattle. They have a 4-chambered stomach, so they have the omasum, the reticulum, the abomasum, and the rumen. And this allows them to digest different types of plants that our bodies would not be able to digest. This talks about some patterns with their diets. So it's a little bit about food plots. Food plots are basically areas that people plant certain vegetation specifically for deer to eat. So you can have ones for them to feed on in the summer, for the winter, or food plots that are specific for when during the hunting season. All right, so let's talk about deer habitat. Whitetails are found in all kinds of different habitats. And so they can adapt to a lot of different conditions. You're going to find them in different types of areas. You'll see lots of deer in urban areas. If you guys drive around parts of Flatwoods or Ashland at night, there's plenty of deer in those areas. All right, and so deer adapt very well to habitat. And we're going to talk about some habitat and the relation to how many deer can live there. So this first one is called mature big woods. So imagine a forest that is the majority of it is big oak, hickory, different hardwood tree species, right? So this is going to be just really big trees, not necessarily a ton of brush underneath them. And so those types hold can sustain around 8 to 10 deer per square mile. So if you had a roughly 640 acre farm, about a maximum of 10 deer. All right. If you have southern mixed hardwoods and pines. So these are going to be trees that are not as big. You're going to have some locusts mixed in. You're going to have some probably some maples and sycamores. You'll have some cedars and some pines and some different things. And maybe some more brush. It's a little bit thicker. It's a little bit hairier. You're going to see 20 to 30 deer, or ideally 20 to 30 deer per square mile. All right. And the reason for that is there's more food there. All right. And then you have an early successional. So imagine if you go and you clear cut a property. All right, you take off all the trees and then you let it grow back. All right, so those next 10 years after you clear cut a property, it's going to be really thick, nasty brush, briars and bristles and all kinds of just really, really thick stuff. That is actually ideal deer habitat. And so that type of habitat can support anywhere from 30 to 50 deer per square mile. And the reason for that is you have tons of cover, you have tons of food. All right, so you don't think about necessarily all that brush as being food, but there's so much vegetation there that is palatable to whitetails that they can really thrive in that environment. So we're going to talk a little bit about the home range of deer. So how big of an area does a deer live in? So this depends a little bit based on the age and the sex of the animal. Doe home ranges can vary from 40 acres to 1,200 acres, but the average being around somewhere between 150 to 500 acres that a doe will stay on its entire life. Buck home ranges, and they figured this out because they captured a bunch of deer. They put radio collars on them and they tracked them. And so it's somewhere between 200 and 2,500 acres based on the season. But average somewhere around 200 to 600 acres. So about a square mile is a buck's home range. They're going to travel outside of that home range a lot during the rut. All right. So when they're actively looking for breeding partners, they're not going to be staying in that narrow of an area. But in their adult life, they do stay in a relatively confined 1 square mile. Typically, bucks that are between 1 and 1.5 years old will 50 to 75% of those bucks, they will leave where they were born and travel 1 to 3 miles away and find a new place to live away from their mother. 25 to 50% of does between 1 to 1.5 years old will also disperse. So the does typically will stay more on a property. The bucks will leave and find somewhere else to go. Yearling dispersal helps ensure genetic variability across a large landscape. So basically, they go somewhere else to live, and so they can find basically a new source or new area to find breeding partners in besides, basically where they grew up. All right, they find something outside the family. So this is a diagram where they radio collared some bucks, and typically, basically from 1.5 to 4.5 every year, the average home range of these deer shrank down. So that 4.5, the smallest they had a buck that didn't leave 108 acre area. The biggest was up to 521 acres. So some of them older bucks, those do shrink down to a pretty small area. Breeding and gestation. So gestation is a very fancy word for pregnancy. And so you're going to have the breeding is going to depend on the area you're talking about. Typically, Midwest, Mid-South, the majority of whitetail areas, November is when the rut occurs. The rut is when does come into heat so that they can be bred. Deer cannot breed at any given time. They have to be bred when the does come in heat. Same with much of your livestock species. So when you get outside of that kind of middle America, Midwest area, going south, you're going to have some places that they rut in July. You have some places they rut in February. So in the very tip of Florida, South Florida, they rut in July and August. In parts of southern Alabama, they rut typically end of January up to February. So a lot of that has to do with the temperatures. but typically here in Kentucky, you're going to see a mid-November rut. Gestation is 195 to 200 days. That is roughly 7 months. Is how long a doe carries a fawn inside of her. So whitetails are mammals. So that means that they produce milk for their young. Um, like I said, fawns are born between 195 and 200 days after conception. In healthy populations, doe fawns 6 months old may be bred and birth a fawn at 1.5 years old. So if it's born in May, it possibly will be bred in November or December and have a fawn the following spring. Does over 2.5 years old have a higher chance of having more than one fawns. So twins and triplets are fairly common. Twins are very common. Triplets a little less common. Um, Fawns are functioning ruminants and can fend for themselves at 3 months of old. Therefore, harvesting a doe early in the season will not cause a fawn to die. A lot of people say if you take a fawn, if it's got spots, and you kill it, it will not survive. That is not necessarily true. At 3 months of age, their body is capable of surviving on uh, food and the environment only. They do not have to have milk at that point. They might still be nursing, but they don't. Their bodies do not require it at that point. Some facts. 7 to 10 days are the most critical for a fawn. At that time, it's going to be spend 95% of the time bedded. So this is a lot of times you're going to find them in hayfields. People will stumble upon them. They're just laying there. That's what they're supposed to be doing because they're just hiding from predators until they get a little bit stronger. That's why they have all the little white spots. It's a camouflage, so it kind of helps them to blend into their environment a little bit. Within a few hours of being born, a fawn is capable of walking, so they'll actually walk the very first day they're born, which is mind-blowing to me if you think how long it takes for a human to be able to walk. Research shows that fawns will be gone from the birth site in less than 10 hours. So they'll give birth in one spot, and then in a minimum of 10 hours later, they will move that fawn somewhere else, and typically that is to protect it from predators because there are going to be things like afterbirth and clues and signs that left behind from the birth that might attract predators, things that they can smell and cue in on. The doe will leave the fawn by itself and return to it throughout the day to nurse it. So if you find a fawn by itself that's not lost, that's what they're supposed to do, right? And the reason for that is the does attract predators, and they know that. So they hide their babies. They go somewhere else and watch from a distance. That way they're not attracting coyotes or bears or whatever it may be to their offspring, to the baby's location. Says there's no documented case of a doe giving birth to more than 4 fawns that have survived. So twins, triplets, common. Quadruplets, not very common, but possible. Past that, there's not any confirmed cases that it happens. So some myths about fawns. I found a fawn, and some mother must have abandoned it. That's not true. We already discussed that they hide them. That's intentional. I found a fawn. It didn't run away. Something must be wrong with it. Also not true. When fawns are young, their instinct is to lay perfectly still and not run away, and just basically to hide instead of run in order to survive. And then last, you have a myth that if you go and you touch a fawn or you pick a fawn up or something, that the doe will not come back for it because she'll smell the human scent. Absolutely not true. You're better off to not touch those fawns, but it is not going to cause the mother from coming back to her baby. So predation. You have a lot of different predators that feed on white-tailed deer fawns. The biggest one's coyotes, followed by black bears, bobcats, feral hogs. Then you also have vehicles. People hit them on the roads. They're harder to see. They're smaller. You also have farm implements. So, like I said, does typically are having fawns right around Memorial Day, which is also typically right around when farmers are getting their first cutting of hay in. And so you're going to see a lot of people on accidentally hit fawns while mowing because their instinct is to hide, to not get up and run, and as sad as it is, it's an unfortunate thing that happens pretty commonly. The biggest source though is coyotes, and some fawn recruitment rates are as low as 30%. Due to predation. So that means if you had 100 does, you're only going to get 30 babies, which is very, very low if you think about that. And also with the common possibility that does can have more than one baby, to only have 30 survive is pretty low. So predation must be taken into consideration with the number of does. So if you have a lot of predators, you don't want to take too many does because the fawn survival rate is pretty low. Talking about antlers versus horns. So deer have antlers. They do not have horns. They're two different things. We're going to explain those real quick. Antlers is the second fastest growing biological tissue known to man. The only thing that grows faster than antlers are some forms of cancer. Antlers are grown every year and they shed annually. So they fall off every year and start back over. And it's really kind of miraculous if you think about it, because they're so strong that they can rub trees with them, they can fight with them, you can drag deer out of the woods with them, they never fall off, and then magically into January, February, their antlers just fall off. And there's some reasons why they do that, and I'll explain. But typically antlers are going to be grown from spring to late summer, so the antlers are going to quit growing somewhere around August or September. They're covered in velvet. Velvet supplies the blood and nutrients for the antlers to be able to grow. So one of the biggest differences between antlers and horns, antlers fall off every year, but also antlers grow from the outside in. So the velvet is on the outside of the antlers. It helps those antlers to grow and then falls off when they're done. So velvet shed in the late summer when the testosterone starts to spike. And as that testosterone spikes, those antlers harden. Antlers are shed in late winter, spring, and so basically the rut is the peak of the testosterone chart, and as that testosterone drips back down, somewhere towards the end of winter, it bottoms out again, and the antlers, that's a biological response to its body, is that the antlers fall off. So this just talks about antlers versus horns. Antlers are actually bone. Whereas horns are a hair. If you think about horns, like on a goat or something like that, or a cow, the feeling, the texture is completely different than what is on a deer's antlers. They're regrown every year. Horns do not. And antlers grow from the tip, while horns grow from the base. So, as a deer grows, it starts here. The base gets a little bit longer, a little bit longer, then a little bit longer. Whereas a horn, you'll have the tip come out, and it just keeps growing stuff underneath and it pushing that out. All right. So this part is grown first on the deer, whereas this part's grown first on a horn. Talking about bachelor groups. So when bucks have that testosterone on the bottom end of the scale, they stay together. Okay, so they're very cordial. They'll live together and make these bachelor groups. They're typically be anywhere from 3 to 5 bucks, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. Typically, you're going to be bucks that are in a similar age group. And so those bucks are going to live together in the spring and summer months. And then as that testosterone increases and that velvet falls off, they will break apart from one another, and they'll become aggressive. They'll start fighting one another, so on and so forth. So we talked about the antlers, how the testosterone is what drives when they lose their velvet and their antlers harden up, and when those antlers then later fall off. So you can see here, this is a deer that's had his antlers shed. So after this in the spring, those antlers will start to grow back out again. And that is it.